What's up, everybody? This is a special episode of The Movies That Make You, and it's going to be basically a conversation with me and one of our fans, one of our podcast listeners. We'll introduce him in the podcast and kind of give you the background, but very excited for today's episode. I hope that you enjoy it. It's probably going to be the first of a few where we just kind of have conversations about life, movies, and how they intersect. So very cool. Again, I can't thank you enough for all of you that are joining and listening each day, each week that we have the episodes drop. All I'd ask is that you'd like the podcast, share the podcast with your friends. Those of you that have kids, that you'd listen to the kid versions, especially with your kids, maybe when you're on your way to school or on a trip. I think it's very important that our children learn how to interact with the entertainment that we're engaging with, instead of just accepting it and just being fed. How is that food? How is that what we're being told? How are we interacting? How are we digesting it, to kind of take the metaphor to the next level? And I think hearing other kids digest what they're ingesting it's too many metaphors, but you know what I'm saying. I think it's good for them to hear kids their own age. And so very excited for this episode today. It's just going to be me and our special guest, and we'll be having a conversation. Be sure to share. If you are going to share, you can share the Spotify link, Apple Podcasts. We're also on YouTube. And please follow us on Instagram. Give us a like on Instagram. Give us a follow. And we post our episodes there, as well as previews to the episodes, at least kind of posting what we're going to be talking about in the next episode, things like that. So feel free to join us there as well. And without further ado, let's get to the podcast. Well, welcome everybody to the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. This is going to be a little bit different than the podcast we've normally done. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our special guest. Wilmar and I met at a special screening of the movie Pi that they showed. They did a re-release in IMAX for just completely beautiful, beautiful black and white film by Darren Aronofsky. And we just got to talking before the film and really connected. Once I started the podcast with the boys, he became an avid listener and was reaching out, sharing thoughts and feedback and giving me pointers. And so the way that the audio sounds today is 100% his fault. So you can thank him for that. And so we were talking and thought it would be good to kind of do an episode like this where he's actually going to we're going to have a conversation. He has some questions that we're going to answer. So that you guys can kind of get to know me as the host of the podcast. But Wilmar, introduce yourself and kind of share a little bit about who you are.
Happy to do so, Jonathan. Well, thank you for having me. Listen, we're gonna kind of like flip the stage, so to speak, and we're gonna go behind the scenes and get to know you better. Yeah, like you said, we met at the showing of Pi. It's a movie that has some significance in my life, and 20 something years ago, when I lived in my country of origin, Guatemala, if you hear a thick accent, it's because I began learning English at age 12, but only came to the United States around age 27. Actually, I came because a project that I was working in my country was a film commission. I had spoken to two presidents in a row about starting what's called a film commission, which is a government office to promote either tax deductions or specific ways so that major film producers would come to the country and shoot film. When you hear that a movie costs $100 million, well, guess what? 20 million goes to the actors, another 20 million goes into equipment, but the rest, about 60 million, goes in expenses on the location where it is shot. And 25 years ago, when the movie Titanic came out, I learned a lot about how Mexico capitalized on that. I started a project for my country. So I dove deep into film. I went to several countries in South America to explore how to create a film festival. I went to Hollywood to try to meet some producers and get films going. And one of the first projects that I worked on was what ended up being Darren Aronofsky's film, The Fountain. If anybody has seen it, it's a film that has to do with Mayan mythology and time travel. Darren Aronofsky is an incredibly gifted director. So when they were going to release Pi, I decided to go see it. The project with Aronofsky never happened in Guatemala. I did meet him. I did work with him a few days, but the project never got off the ground. It ended up being shot 5 years later in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. But again, when I saw the premiere, the release of Pi, I had to be there. I brought my DVD that had his autograph to maybe if I start a conversation with another Aronofsky fan, I just show one of the last glimpses of my involvement in the movie industry. And there were you. And we hit it off. We began chatting, and that was in March. And in November, you started your podcast, and yeah, you covered the rest of it. So here we are. I'm also a podcast host here in Dallas. It's called the Love Live Rocking Podcast. After COVID, I began attending a lot of concerts with my children. I also have 4 children like yourself, and wanted to know more about those musicians performing rock covers on stage. And I started a podcast, so I've learned a lot about that as well. And so a love for movies and an interesting podcast is what brought us together.
Absolutely.
All right, so ready to get started? I have a few questions for you. So let me ask you the most puzzling question to me when I was listening to the first episode is how do you get 4 young men to cooperate, man? Because they're between the ages of 10 and 13. How do you get them to each take turns, respect each other's times, share their thoughts, and have what's a very interesting dialogue?
Man, it's actually been fairly simple. Now we do get off topic sometimes, and I do some editing behind the scenes to keep it a little bit more succinct. But for the most part, the fact that it's audio allows me to do a lot of some visual, like I tell them to raise their hand when they have something to say. I just try to get them into the rhythm of waiting to speak until someone else is finished, and they get excited and want to raise their hands. They want to say something. I'm able to hold my hand and say, "Okay, wait your turn." I'm doing a lot of visual cues that way when we're doing an audio podcast. I wanted to do video at first, but I just felt like it was just going to be a headache to try and get all that organized. But I felt like with audio, we could kind of get them used to the dialogue, used to the conversations, and then I could, of course, by cueing them with words, get some of the other ones to talk and hold others off when something kind of one episode becomes like one person just wanting to say everything that they want to say. So a little bit of visual cues and a little bit of patience, a lot of patience, and
You know
then
what?
some editing.
It's interesting. You remind me of a movie director who actually shows up and tells, "I just let people do their job and just give them a couple of cues." But actually, what people don't know is the hundreds of hours of rehearsal that goes behind the scenes and in advance. So you must be doing a lot of work behind the scenes with them, because I needed to commend you on that. Again, as a father of 4, I love the concept, I love the idea, but the execution seems to be working. I'm also a full-time teacher, so I know how challenging it may be to work with teenagers. Let me ask you the next question. I have some prepared, and some are going to happen as we go over in this conversation. But what drives you to talk about movies, and how do you persuade your children to talk with you about movies? Because there's a generational gap in every family, but with movies, changes in technology, changes in topics, there's quite a gap as well. But what drove you to tell them, let's talk about movies?
Well, so I started getting into movies. I've always kind of enjoyed movies, growing up. I've talked on the podcast with Kristen, growing up as early as like Star Wars when I was younger, Ghostbusters, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about those as this episode goes on. But movies have always kind of played a part in my life, and so and it's also something I love to do as a part of experiencing something with someone I care about and sharing something that I love with the people I love. And that's kind of where it came from. I mean, when I started dating Kristen, it was like this whole list of movies that she hadn't seen that I'm like, oh, you have to see these. And that's what kind of started the list of the movies that make you think, the movies that make you feel, the movies that make you laugh. And so I started tracking all those movies. And then when we have the kids on the weekends, we have the kids, it was like, well, let's go to see a movie. Well, what do you want to see? Oh, we got to see this. Well, I haven't seen that. And so it began this whole thing of, okay, not just Kristen, but now I've got 2 other kids, plus my own boys that I'm bringing to the relationship that like they haven't seen some of these movies that I love. And now as they're getting a little older, it's kind of like, I want to share some of these other movies, these movies that are a little bit more head, more thinking films now that they can kind of understand the concepts. So kind of sharing movies with my family is something I love to do. And so that's something just we have done. And I was just kind of listening to a podcast about movies, and I was thinking to myself, like, man, I love sharing movies with my family, and I love talking about it. And we've done a lot of that already. Like I've already walked them through Indiana Jones and Star Wars and Marvel and DC, and not to mention all the other movies that we watch as a family. I think it would be fun to have a conversation with them. Like, how are they reacting to the movies that I loved as a kid? Like I wish I would have had the podcast, and we'll probably do this episode at some point, but we watched through the Back to the Future series over the course of a month. when we have the kids, we watch an episode, and then the next time we had them, we'd watch another one. And so it's kind of like, I wish I would have had the opportunity to have the podcast in, because I could go like, okay, so what did you guys think? What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? How were the graphics? I could recognize that CG. That's one thing they always say. Oh, I see the editing. I'm like, yeah, but remember, this is 1980, or this is 1975, or this is the first time anybody had ever done anything like this. So it allows us to kind of have that, from a technical standpoint, about just kind of enjoying the film and kind of where films have come and gone. But I think the deeper question and the deeper thing that I love to do with movies is like have a conversation afterwards. So a good example would be when we're watching the Star Wars films, and we're going through the episodes 1 through 3, where we see Anakin as a kid, which the boys can relate to, and then he's a teenager, and then he kind of turns to the dark side. It allowed me to have conversations like, what is it that made him choose that? Like when we're seeing him go out and rage on some Tusken Raiders, like what happened that made him do that? Why do you think he was that angry? What made him make that choice? And recognize that these aren't too far off from the choices that we can make as humans, because that one little thing can kind of trigger us and make us go into a rage moment. So how do we counteract that? How do we make sure that we're being people of the light instead of people of the dark side? And so that's just kind of one example of how I try to talk about movies and like how it relates to how we act in real life.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So, what is it then? Not what drives you to talk about movies, but what is it that drives you to examine human behavior so deeply? I agree with you. I have the same perspective of movies. I think our tastes differ a lot. I am not at all a fan of action movies.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the Star Wars, of course, but I am fascinated by how they portray human behavior, human choice, the concepts of fate, destiny, eternity, mortality. However, being this an episode to get to know you, what do you think is behind that desire that you have to examine the human behavior in fictitious characters?
Well, I think a lot of it probably stems from my religious upbringing, and then kind of getting into college and taking a religion. I was a religion major in college. I became a pastor. I was a pastor for about 14 years. Um, Ended up leaving the ministry, but I didn't leave behind the fact that I spent so much of my time and energy in college and beyond really trying to understand what drives us as humans and what makes us make the choices that we make, and what is it that can cause us to turn and make the right choice versus making the wrong choice. And then examining my own life and knowing that I've made bad choices and I've ended up where I am because of the choices I've made. And then also just becoming a father and recognizing like I'm not alone in this world anymore. I have 2 young men and now 4 young men that I'm trying to raise and help them know what it means to
Yeah.
be good and make the right choices and to live for something more than yourself. And I think the way that movies play into that is that it allows us to catch a glimpse of someone else's life. It allows us to see something that's just far enough, especially with something that's like Star Wars or something that's a little bit more sci-fi. It allows us to kind of disconnect from this being our own world enough that we can see it a little bit from the outside. We can examine it, and then we can connect the dots. I try to help them connect the dots between like, well, that's kind of like what we deal with in this way. And I think movies allow us to examine those things that in movies that are more realistic, you can see those people in life that I would never be able to interact with. I've never been in that situation, but it makes me more empathetic. And then also in some of the more bombastic movies, we can kind of make that connection that like, oh, they're really saying something deep about our own humanity, and try to connect those dots for my kids.
Well, I definitely can see how empathetic you are, and the worldview that you have such a passion for people, for humanity, as I've listened to your podcast. But let me go back a little bit. What year were you born?
1980.
1980. You're 5 years younger than I am. And I'm asking this to try to set the context of the movies that you might have watched growing up. Star Wars, at least the first trilogy, was almost over by the time you were learning to speak English, because if I'm not mistaken, they were done in 83. You talked about your religious upbringing. Tell us a little bit about this. Where did it happen? In which state were you raised? And why do you call it a religious upbringing?
So I was born in Jacksonville, Florida. My father was a pastor as well. He was a youth pastor and music minister. And my mom was the church secretary for a number of years. Um, And then they moved from I was born in 1980 in Jacksonville, Florida, and then they moved to Kansas City in '82, where my dad went to seminary.
Do you have memories of him graduating?
So that's a really big deal. So he had diabetes, and by the time he was graduating from seminary, he couldn't walk very strongly. So he was using crutches a lot and many times a wheelchair. But I remember this subtly. I mean, I was five or six at the time. I remember it kind of in that distant kind of child memory of being in the room when he walked across the stage, and like the entire place, like the entire school, gave him a standing ovation because they knew how much it was to walk across that stage. And so he was definitely a likable person. People valued him, and that is definitely a core memory for me.
You know what? It makes me think of a couple of things. My mom also had diabetes, and she passed last January, 12 months ago.
Oh,
Now, what's really striking is that we now have technology around us so much. We can be recording not only this podcast, but videos every day. Our children can be recording videos every day. And yet, you and I don't have access to much of imagery of our parents, probably because of that. Like my father passed around 99 or 2000. I cannot tell you the year because it was a traumatic event.
yeah,
Uh, I just don't remember it.
yeah.
So I don't have any video footage of him ever. I don't think there was ever video footage taken of him. And when you speak of this moment, I'm inclined to ask you, how does it feel watching the video? And then I think, okay, this was 1985,
Right.
1986. There's definitely no video of that.
And I'm not sure if we have any video of that moment. But it's funny you say that. My mom was just visiting for our Christmas time and holidays, and she brought a box full of old pictures and things like that. So I got to share that with the boys and kind of show them my dad and all that stuff. He ended up passing away in 1987. But I do have a video of him, and I have audio of him that I can go back to and watch and listen. And there's a video of him singing with my mom that I have, and there's audio tapes that he would record and record singing to me, or record me singing or talking, and he would just kind of go through that exercise. So I have a bunch of those tapes as well, audio tapes that I have to listen to his voice and to hear his voice singing and hear him talking to me, and of course to hear my little talking as early as I could, and then singing once I was able to say words and things like that. So I do have some memories of that.
Those are beautiful moments. I'm glad you have them on tape. As a fan of your podcast, I love to listen to them because, in a way, I also am aware that your father instilled your love for movies. But also in your Instagram, you can share those just for people that are becoming fans of your podcast. Now, let me ask you something. Why not music? If your father was a music minister, if he even went as far as recording you singing and all that, why do you think that instead of the music bug, you were hit with the movie bug?
That's a great question. I'll often ask it myself. I think because I actually went to school, I got my religion degree, but I also got a minor in music, and I was a music minister at the churches, while I also did some youth ministry and did some preaching as well. I was kind of the worship guy too. So music has always been a part. And I don't know what the disconnect is, but there's a sense where I ended up being, I think in my early years, I was very focused in on contemporary Christian music. I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music for a while. And then when I did start listening to secular music, my tastes were kind of popular, but a little bit across the spectrum. But I'm also a creature of like when I find music I like, I kind of stick to it, and I don't really expand my horizons too much. And so, I mean, I could do a whole podcast probably with Dave Matthews Band, and I could probably have content for a few years. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know that I have enough content to do like a full music podcast. And I don't really branch out and listen to new music. Sometimes I'll listen to stuff on the radio, but I'm not really buying CDs all the time anymore.
Well,
I'm
buddy,
kind of,
nobody is buying
yeah,
CDs.
yeah, right. Well,
Let me
even,
let me
yeah,
tell
yeah,
you something. I want to rephrase the question. I know about not dedicating yourself to a music podcast, but for example, my father never became fluent in English. He never learned to speak English. However, he began teaching me some English phrases through the music of bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Grand Funk Railroad,
Yeah.
and Boston. My first words in English come off a Boston song called More Than a Feeling. And I can listen to rock from the 70s and 80s and sometimes weep, even though they might be a hard rock song, weep
Hmm.
with a connection to my father. But in your case, it seems that something about movies connects you different than music. Do you think that the fact that you were restricted to listen to only contemporary Christian music, which, by the way, when I became a Christian around the early '90s, I was in a congregation that encouraged that because it was a lower economic status and I live in a different country. We didn't have access to all the music that you guys have here, but I found access to all the CCM music, and I'm talking about the popular artists: Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, Newsboys,
Hmm.
Petra, Trapper, all that. But that church spoke strongly and adamantly against listening to any music that was not Christian, and even Christian rock was condemned. Do you
Sure.
think that the fact that you were restricted on music prevented you from feeling the same sort of freedom or connection with it? Did it become a duty, maybe? Was it more of a professional choice to go into college? I'm just curious because to me, although I deeply love movies and having incredible connection to them, music can move me even further a little bit, or at least with much more ease, because you can hear a song in the car or anywhere, but to watch a movie you
Yeah.
need to create a space. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about
Yeah.
that.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm right there with you. I think music definitely affects me in a very deep way. And I think as we think about the podcast and the intent of the podcast and kind of the vision of the podcast is sharing that with the kids. My kids, they aren't all into music. And they have like whatever's playing on Fortnite, like they're into that song for the minute, and then but they aren't really connecting with that music. Um, but I will say I do share songs with them at certain times if we're on a trip or we're in a certain season like Christmas, like the Christmas episode, I talked about the Nat King Cole's, um, Connor shared about how the Nat King Cole song, when that record is played, I know it's Christmas. And that was because I shared that song being a song that I grew up listening with my dad. And so I do share music with them subtly, but it's not enough. They aren't all into it as much as I can. Movies for the kids are a little bit more approachable, and so I think that's where I started. But it
I
is funny where you bring it up, because I honestly, a few weeks ago I was thinking, man, I need to do the music that makes you laugh, the music that makes you cry, because there are those things, those ideas, and maybe we'll do some one-off episodes where we take a break and we say, hey, let's do a week on music, because as they're getting older, Jacob and Colton are getting into band, and they're playing French horn, both of them.
Mhm.
And so there's a sense where they're getting their musical tastes broadened, because it's away from the hip hop that's on the radio, and they're having to play these more classical pieces, and they're learning to appreciate it. So I do think there's a chance to where we can bring that in. And one last thing on that is, like I mentioned Dave Matthews Band earlier. This past summer was the first time I took my oldest Jacob to a Dave Matthews Band concert, and then we went to an NF concert, which is Christian, kind of the Christian hip hop artist. And it was like I'm trying to introduce them to concert music, but Jacob, I think, was the only one that I thought would sit there and listen to it and not complain. And so there's a sense that as they get older, as they expand their horizons, there may be more opportunity to bring music in, for sure.
So is it fair to say that at the core of your motivation and the reason for the podcast is the desire to connect with those who are children that live with you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I felt it was a different idea, a different concept than just me being on and talking about movies, which I think I want to take some podcasts and do that, because there are some movies that are really dear and dear to my heart, that I may not have shared with the boys or shared with Kristen yet. Um, but I felt like the uniqueness is something I hadn't heard of in a podcast arena, where it's a father sharing these movies with his kids and letting the kids kind of dictate the content. And I just felt like that would be a fun thing to bring to people. I felt like, and of course, in our conversations, hoping that it could be something that parents could use to help their kids engage with these movies in a deeper level.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree, and that's actually why I became a fan because I listen to a lot of podcasts. But your angle is quite great. Now, you did mention your religious upbringing. You talked about going to a Christian college. Now, let me ask you. You also mentioned the phrase you had to leave ministry. You want to expand on that?
Absolutely. I was putting everybody else's desires and hopes for me, or their wants of me above my own and above my family. And so, being in ministry, you are on call 24/7. So, if somebody calls from church, like you got to step away and take the call, or if there's a meeting at church, you have to miss that kid's event. If there's this, if there's that, and so that was already taking me away from my family, and putting a priority above my family, which that shouldn't have. I was involved in a band at the same time, and that took a lot of time away from my family. But I didn't want to let those bandmates down, and so if they needed me, then I had to be there. And so there's this sense where I found like I have this codependency in me that I put everybody else's feelings and everybody else's emotions above mine and above my family's, to the point that it led me to that kind of place where I was not being able to be a good father or a good husband or a good person, because I was so worried about what others felt, what other people wanted of me, instead of worrying about what was the best thing, what was the right thing. Another layer to that is recognizing that the love that God has for me is not failing, that He's still there, accepting me and loving me. And that was that journey from kind of leaving the ministry and then getting back into the ministry. It was that point where I felt like, well, God still has plans for me. God still loves me. God still wants to use me in some capacity. And things started to kind of turn around for my self-worth as well.
I have discovered some aspects of your personal life only through the podcast. For the record, and for the audience member, you and I only chatted a little bit about the movie when we sat next to each other. We have never seen each other in person or talked
Yeah.
until today. So everything I've learned about you has been through your podcast. And I was surprised in your Christmas episode, you mentioned the movie The Family Man. I was going through my first divorce, if I'm not mistaken, 2001 is when that movie came out.
Yep.
And I remember I loved it so much because it's about this man having a second chance to redo everything all over. In his case, he had just never had a family, but anybody knows The Family Man by now. And I remember that I loved that movie so much that I went back into the theater 2 times. I watched it 3 times in a row.
Yeah.
And that was around Christmas. And coincidentally, 5 or 6 years later, I was going through my second divorce, this time in Houston. I had moved to United States. And when we were going through the divorce, I was home alone on December 25th. She had gone to her country to visit her family. And I ended up watching the movie Love Actually 5 times. Both are somewhat Christmas themed movies, but
Yep.
I connect both to somewhat of a healing experience. Even though after watching those movies, I still pursue trying to rebuild those relationships. I had done enough harm that it never happened. There was never a reconciliation. But those movies gave me a lot of hope, companionship, and yeah, hope for the future in a way. And obviously my life ended up taking a different path afterwards. But let me ask you something. What do you think it then is a purpose that movies can serve? You talked about movies providing this glimpse of the life of other people, and I know that you've heard once this phrase from a pastor, if I'm not wrong, that they provide you a glimpse at a life we will not experience ourselves. But what purpose do you think movies serve? That is something that in the end you're also trying to share not only with your children but with the audience. What is the purpose behind movies that can be what we would say movies at their best?
I think at their best, they make us feel something. The logo that we have for our podcast, feel is right in the middle there, and then love and cry, I think, are the other two that are you kind of visibly see as a scroll wheel. But that's the thing that sticks out to me, is that the really good movies, the ones that really stick with you, is because they made you feel something. And maybe it was in your sense, your movies that you mentioned, it was a sense of hope in the middle of despair, and so it stuck with you and it sticks with you. And I think even when we think about some of the movies that maybe the people that like the Marvel movies aren't necessarily going out to see all the Oscar movies, but the reason that the Oscar movies are there, the reason that the Oscar movies are there, exist, and those types of movies, is because of how they make us feel. They make us feel something different than what we would see in life on our own. I think I've said a few times, like the empathy that it brings when I can experience something and see something that I wouldn't have experienced myself, or at the times when it's something that I have experienced and it's kind of bringing those feelings back and allowing me to kind of either gain healing from that moment, or just allow me to kind of sit in that sadness or that hopefulness for a little bit. I would say one of the movies that does stick out to me is the movie Milk. And this is kind of playing into the religious upbringing. Milk is the movie. It's a story about Harvey Milk, who was
The
the
first gay
first.
mayor of San Francisco.
Exactly. It starred Sean Penn, and it was a movie that the villain of the movie was an evangelical woman that was going around on the news and talking crap about Harvey Milk. And I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm not necessarily someone who, at that time, I wasn't necessarily someone who was supportive of LGBT stuff. I wasn't. It wasn't really something we talked about a lot. But I also, at the same time, just felt myself being very, very sad for Harvey in that movie. I was sad for the way that someone that I thought was supposed to be representing the love of God and the love of Christ was treating someone. And so that really that tapped into something into me that I can't really explain because it wasn't taught, but it was just a feeling of like, there's something that in my mind, we have to do differently as Christians if we're going to really show God's love. And it's not criticizing people. It's not demeaning them. It's not villainizing them. It's loving them.
I want to ask you a couple of questions, but for the sake of where I'm trying to get, I need short answers. Do you still
Okay.
see yourself as a committed Christian?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Do you believe it is part of your mission to try to spread the gospel?
Yes.
And do you see yourself as a person who, defining himself as a Christian, has a responsibility as to how others may perceive your actions or words?
I do.
Okay. Now let me ask you this. Like the movie that you mentioned and many others portray Christians in a less than positive light. They portray Christians as judgmental, as one-dimensional characters that are quote unquote obsessed with God and that are hell-bent on judging others.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile what you said about yourself as seeing yourself as a person who is a Christian, where you are also very passionate about an industry that, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because regardless of the reviews, I like to see well fleshed out characters, evil
Mm-hmm.
characters with a dose of good, or well meaning characters with a dose of evil, which is just like we all people are. But how do you reconcile your love for our movies and the fact that they tend to misrepresent the community which you identify the closest with, the Christian community?
Where I reconcile that is because when I'm seeing those portrayals in the movies, I'm recognizing that that's a true version of a Christian in the world, or at least someone who professes Christianity. I haven't seen a movie where they portray a Christian in a negative light that I haven't already experienced myself. And so I can in some ways relate to that character. I can relate to the people experiencing that character. There are people out there that think like that. There are people out there that feel like that. And so I can empathize with the people that are on the other side, and I can stand with them. That's what I find so valuable is the movies in those instances should be giving us a glimpse at ourselves. If we are that way, we should be recognized. If we're getting offended by something that's portraying in that light, we should probably take a look in the mirror. When I see those characters, I relate to the other side more. I would like to share one other movie we actually just watched called The Wonder, and it's a really interesting movie. It's set in kind of it's set in Ireland, and it's older. It's got Florence Pugh in it. She plays a nurse who's been asked to watch this young girl who has some sort of spiritual ability to live without eating.
Wow.
And she sits with them, and then the nun sits with the girl, and they're trying to basically keep watch of her and see how is she surviving. Is this a real miracle or is it not? And I don't want to give away anything, but I would suggest if you're interested at all in those types of conversations, like I told Kristen, this should be required reading or required viewing for anybody who calls himself a Christian. if it's only just to show what happens when we look at the mystery of the scriptures without using our brain and recognizing that there's beauty in the mystery, and there's also beauty in the mind. And so anyway, it's a really interesting where you can kind of take, if you put your foot too hard on one side of an issue because you know it has to be true, or else then you might find yourself, sinking.
Okay, so you said the name of this movie was The Wonder.
It's a Netflix film. Yeah,
Great. It should be easy for anybody to watch, and I'll also be looking forward to the episode Parent Edition, where you and your wife Kirsten can tell us your thoughts after I've watched it.
for
Um,
sure.
so listen, you were talking about that movies make you feel. So I want to ask you the following, but I'm going to give you a list of three movies that you cannot talk about while you answer the question. You cannot talk about Star Wars, you cannot talk about The Matrix, and you cannot talk about Ghostbusters.
Okay.
What is that movies have made you feel the most and most significant in your life? Where have they had the biggest impact in your feelings of any movie watching experience? And obviously, let's exclude Milk, that you already talked about that one.
Did you exclude Marvel?
No, I did not.
Okay. Well, I will say this then. You
Please,
didn't say.
please enlighten me, Jonathan, because listen, I have kids who love those movies.
Yeah.
I cannot. I've tried watching the Avengers like 3 times. I fell asleep in the first 15
Yeah.
minutes. And
I
I
know.
love Thor, maybe because I used to love the cartoon when I was a kid, and maybe that's why I'm not into them. I have no childhood connections to them. I come from a different
Sure.
country. My kids love them, and man, it's a dread to go with them to those movies. I did watch Captain Marvel, not the Marvels, but the first one. I
Yeah.
loved it. I was probably fascinated by the fact that at the time my daughters were 9 and 8, and I thought it presented an incredibly empowering female model. But
Yeah.
other than that, I mean, I know that they're action blockbusters, but I don't get them. You could not pay me $25 to sit down and watch an Avengers movie with you.
I
So,
totally understand that, brother.
so
I totally
please,
do.
please share with me, how do you see behind the explosions and behind the cartoonish characters? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, like, like
Yeah.
superheroes. What hits home in your heart?
So there's a sense where in the movie Endgame, it is the 23rd or 24th in a series of films showing these characters.
That's when Iron Man dies, right? And they have like a
Yeah.
10-minute funeral scene. I didn't
Yeah.
get what people were crying about. I was like, dude, just another person that dies. I did
For
watch that, by
sure.
the way, I
For
think.
sure. So I think for me, and I was actually just talking to my boss about this. For me, I did definitely where the emotions hit me. I mean, the Iron Man's death definitely hit me hard. But here's the thing that really moves me about that movie, um, is that one, Captain America, who is by all accounts a Boy Scout, and they've said for years you can't make a good Superman movie because nobody can be all good. Why would you cheer for him? And here we have Captain America, who is by all accounts being the best of all of us, even in the face of in Age of Ultron, um, having to like leave the Avengers because they're choosing the side of the government instead of choosing the side of right. He has to lose everything for the sake of a relationship with a friend that he saw die and wants to help and get him back to his right mind. Like there's all this stuff going on. Captain America, who for his from his first movie to his second movie to all the Avengers says, "I could do this all day." Even in an end game, he's fighting himself, and he hears himself say it. He's like, "Ah, yeah, I know. Shut up." Because he's frustrated at the fact that this kid version of himself keeps saying, "I could do this all day." In the face of Thanos and his full army, Thanos is just, everybody's been destroyed or everybody's fallen to the wayside except for Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man. The three of them face off against Thanos, and it just whoops them one by one. And Captain America is left by himself, and he stands up and he tightens his shield one more time, and he says, basically mentally, and for all of us watching, he says, "I can do this all day." And all of a sudden, it's him against the entire army.
Mm-hmm.
It's him against everybody. And he's not going to let anything stop him from doing what's right. He's not going to let anybody stop him from trying to save the ones he loves, trying to bring back the ones he loves. He's not going to let anything stop him, so he's going to go down swinging. And at that moment, he hears his friend say, "On your left." And he realizes in the midst of that moment that he's not alone. He's not by himself. He's not on an island with no help. And when I think about the journey of life, how so many times we look at the armies around us and we feel like we're alone in this battle. We feel like we have no one we can lean on. We feel like there's no one that's here to help us, and I'm left on my own. We're not alone.
Well, that's a powerful connection to what I see in you constantly, and it's yeah, an incredible desire for having a more empathetic world and a very empathetic heart. So let me ask you, do you think that sometimes those movies represent a better version of the world that you wish we could see around us?
I really do. I think we would love to have people in like the Avengers that would always make the right decision. And even we recognize that in those moments, like they made mistakes, but they needed to own up to them. That's part of why, the government stepped in and said, "Oh, you can't keep doing that because you're making mistakes." While meanwhile, there, we have a armies and stuff. Who knows who they're killing all over the world? But but it's we're trying to, some of those movies, and I'd say some of those movies are meant to do that. That's another thing that movies are meant for, is to make us see a hope, make us see a better picture of what our world could be like. If only we could get to there. It paints a picture of what the world we currently live in is not, but it gives us something to strive for.
Yeah, that's a beautiful concept, and I certainly appreciate your transparency with how these movies have touched you. Now, let me undo my previous prohibition. Let's. I want to skip the Matrix because we have less than 10 minutes of a lot of time, and I've heard, I don't know why, and I've heard that it's your absolute favorite movie. I mean, I don't know
Yes,
why, not in a cynical way. I just don't know your reasons. I absolutely
sure.
love the movie. I am still confused as to how a lot. I remember at the time it came out, I was working at an insurance agency where there were a lot of Christian guys in seminary, and they said that it was the gospel made movie. I'm like, I don't get it, what the connection is, but that's maybe topic for another moment. I also don't want to talk about Ghostbusters yet because of time. I want you to tell me about Star Wars. What do you recall about the first time you were exposed to Star Wars? What did it make you feel then? What does it make you feel now?
I remember sitting. It was in Kansas City, which I would have been between 3 and 5. I know that Empire Strikes Back came out the year I was born. The youth group that my dad was ministering to called me Baby Yoda, uh, be, be,
Oh my
because
gosh,
of,
you could have
yeah.
patented the name back then.
I know. Um, yeah, and so 83 would have been Return of the Jedi, and we would have had the VHS tapes. I think for me it was and I have the same reaction later years with movies like Harry Potter, or other like coming of age, or maybe like those like hero's journey movies, um, where it's like a kid from nowhere who develops this power that he didn't know was there, and he's able to do things he never thought he could. I think for me too, like the lightsabers being this kind of elegant sword, this elegant battle versus just a blaster. The idea of like the knight in shining armor in this kind of futuristic, ancient future world. The princess, the damsel in distress. It felt like, the fairy tales that I grew up hearing. But it was done in this kind of weird future ancient world. The father son story definitely stood out. Um, but I think it really was the fantastical nature of it. It wasn't a sci-fi movie. Star Trek didn't really resonate with me as a kid. Star Trek felt too sci-fi, too heady, too sciency. I've watched all of them since I was a kid, and I find them fine. They're good. There's some good stuff in there. But what kind of grabbed me for Star Wars was more the fantastical elements. It felt like the knights of the Round Table. Like when we get to the Jedi Council in episode 2, and they're all fighting in the arena. It felt very much like this old world thing, but with this kind of futuristic vision.
Let me ask you, you said that your father was the one who invited you to watch it, and so you watched it at home?
Yeah, we watched it on VHS in the basement in
Okay.
Kansas City. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were restrictions on you listening to music. The only reason I asked this question is because when I began attending a church that was not a Catholic church in my country, an evangelical church, they said, we are Christians, we don't dance, we don't listen to rock music, we don't go to the movies. Uh, it seemed to me that there were a lot of similarities, but it seems that movies wasn't off the table in your denomination.
So they were, so for a long time going to the movies was off the table. So my mom was on staff as the church secretary, when my dad was the pastor, it was frowned upon to go to the movies, because that's where bad things happen, I guess.
Correct.
But everybody had a VCR, so you could just go down to the family video store, pick up a PG movie or under, and you were still okay with God, I guess.
So the movie wasn't the problem. The problem was the movie theater and the theater going experience.
Yeah, I think it was tied, honestly, to the a lot of that was tied to kind of
Sex.
probably the triple X movies, or nudity in films. It was
Well,
like,
listen,
yeah,
when I was a teenager, I never went to movies because I couldn't afford it. But I remember that was the place where you wanted to go if you wanted to kiss a girl for the first time.
there you go. Yep,
That was
yep.
the
Sit in the
only
back.
point of
Yep.
going to a theater. But let's just step away from the movie itself, Star Wars, and we have about 5 minutes or less. I only say that to clarify. I will probably not have much follow up on this. Tell me about your dad as you remember him through the connections to Star Wars. And let me frame this in a different way. I hear a song called More Than a Feeling by Boston, and I can cry. My children, who were born 20 years after he passed, hear that song and sometimes say, that's your father's song. Again, my father never learned English. I don't think he ever fully got the whole lyrics of the song, but it's a song I connect deeply to him. So is the music of Led Zeppelin.
Mhm.
And I think of my dad. I mean, I
Yeah.
might like or not like the music too much. I feel warm and fuzzy and nostalgic, and sometimes weep, and sometimes get very emotional just listening to that classic rock music. Tell me about your feelings in connection to your father when it comes to Star Wars.
I think a lot of it just stems back to that feeling of sitting next to him, um, and watching on the little couch in the basement, the little small TV that we had to walk up and turn the channels, because they didn't have remotes yet, or if they did, we didn't own one. And it was the fantasticalness, the fun joy of experiencing this with my dad. I remember him sitting in the chair, me sitting on his lap, and those types of things. I think the other movie that jumps out too is like Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, that was one that we watched, and that had to cover my eyes at scary parts and things like that. So it was sitting and just enjoying and laughing and cheering and doing the voices and playing um, playing like we're in the characters. It's just one of those things that you always hold on to, because it's those early core memories of the fascinations with this other world, that exists. Yeah.
Well, did you have a hard time watching those movies after he passed?
I think as a kid, I didn't watch them too much. And that definitely might have been part of it. As I got older, and as the newer movies came out and kind of revisiting them, it definitely brought up some emotions, the first few times, just because I haven't seen this since, that sort of thing. And it was a good feeling, though. It was good memories. And it's still one of those things that I am now sharing with my kids, and wanting them to experience those moments like I experienced with my dad. So that's partly, I mean, that's a lot of why I'm doing this podcast, for sure.
And you know what? There's no better way to close this podcast. I wanted to tell you that. I wanted to tell you that through your voice, I can hear how beautiful those memories were. And through your conversations with your children on the podcast, I can hear that you're doing the exact same thing. You're creating eternal memories, or at least ever long-lasting memories on this earth, depending on each person's concept of eternity. You're creating the best memories of family, of a bond, and it's really neat to know that you're using this podcast to share that with the audience as well, to give them opportunity to consider that. Um, and I am honored that you have given me this opportunity to chat with you, to ask questions. Listen, I have a few pages here full of questions that I didn't get to, but that's the nature of a podcast. It's just a conversation about things we care about. I do see why you care about movies. I've learned to appreciate your love for movies a lot. I am more intrigued about your personal story. I'm more intrigued about certain movies that you like, but that's the time that we have now. Just want to say that again. Thank you for sharing this. Thank you for sharing movies with your children and sharing that journey with us, because it's an example. Because of their ages, I have not done that as much over the last couple of years. During COVID, we had a routine. Every week we would watch a couple of documentaries, and they were
Yeah.
mandatory. They could not go to the film movies unless we watch documentaries. By now they don't want. They like, oh no, not a documentary. So I'm like, okay. But I love your podcast. I think it's a great listen for people to play in the car, listen with their kids, or let the parents themselves can hear it and hear what children might think about it. You and your wife share great insight about how to choose movies that children can watch or not, and even movies that you can enjoy as a couple. So I appreciate your transparency. I've learned a lot about your journey. If we get a chance, and this is me pitching you an idea, I wanted to touch upon how movies and these conversations have even helped you steer a blended family in your case, which I think is something that I can see your four kids coming together through this movie viewing experience. But again,
Yeah,
we do not have the time today,
for
Jonathan.
sure.
So all I want to say is thank you for the time. Thank you for being so transparent in this conversation and in the podcast. And I hope that we made it worth the time of our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see Wilmer back. I hope he'll join us again. Until next time, have a good one, guys. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the podcast. And thank you, Wilmer, so much, being an avid listener and for joining me in this conversation. This is the movies that make you. And one of the things that we said in this podcast was movies are good when they make you feel something. And sometimes that's joy, it's excitement when you're watching a Fast and Furious movie or you're watching Finding Nemo. It makes you feel happy. Makes you feel hopeful. Sometimes they make you feel sad and make you feel depressed, but that's a part of the human experience. Many times these movies are giving you an experience so you can be more empathetic, or so that you can reflect on the way that you would interact with those scenarios and all those things. So excited to again, like I said before, excited to have more conversations with Wilmer, and excited for you guys to share the podcast. We hope that this has been enjoyable for you, and look forward to next time. So until then, give us a like, share, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, and appreciate all the support. Have a great one. We'll see you next time.